Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into the sometimes murky waters of FDA regulatory guidelines.
It can be pretty dense stuff,
Oh, yeah. A lot of acronyms and a lot of moving parts.
definitely. But really important to understand, right? I mean, we're talking about the rules that govern everything from, the pills we take
Mm.
to the medical devices used in hospitals.
Right. When you think about it, the FDA's role is so critical because they're basically protecting public health by ensuring that all these products that, affect our lives, pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, even tobacco, are safe and effective. And they don't just oversee the initial approval process, they're involved throughout the entire life cycle of a product.
Right, from the moment a company starts developing something new to the way it's manufactured, marketed, and even used after it's on the market. And what makes it even more complex these days is how all of these industries, pharmaceuticals, biologics, devices, they're all starting to converge, especially with all these combination products popping up.
Yeah, the lines are getting blurry. So, what we're hoping to do today for you, our listeners, is to unpack this complex world of FDA regulations. We'll look at each of those key industries, pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, and tobacco, and try to pull out the most essential information about the different regulatory paths that apply to each one.
We want to give you a clear understanding of the underlying principles that drive the FDA's decision-making without, getting lost in the weeds.
Absolutely. So let's start with the pharmaceutical industry. What exactly does the FDA consider to be a pharmaceutical?
Well, according to the FDA, a pharmaceutical is any chemical product,
Yeah.
we typically call them drugs, that's intended for use in the diagnosis, treatment, cure, mitigation, or prevention of disease in humans. It could also be a product that's intended to affect the structure or function of the body.
So this covers a huge range of products, right? Everything from like over-the-counter pain relievers to really specialized prescription medications.
Exactly. And it includes both the brand name drugs, which are often protected by patents, and their generic equivalents, which typically enter the market after the patent protection expires. The key, of course, is the active ingredient. That's the specific chemical substance in the drug that's actually responsible for producing the intended therapeutic effect.
And one of the first things you notice when you start looking at the FDA's approach to pharmaceuticals is that they make a pretty clear distinction between traditional pharmaceutical companies and those that are developing biologics.
Right. It's a fundamental difference in how the products are created. Traditional pharmaceutical companies rely on chemical synthesis to produce their drugs, basically combining specific chemical ingredients in a controlled way. Biopharmaceutical companies, on the other hand, use biotechnology methods to create their products. They leverage living organisms, like bacteria or yeast cells, to produce the desired therapeutic substance.
So it's like chemistry versus biology.
Right, and that distinction has a really big impact on the regulatory path these products have to go through. It's especially evident when you compare pharmaceuticals to biologics, which we'll get to later.
Okay, so now let's talk about one of the most important aspects of pharmaceutical regulation, good manufacturing practices. You hear those three letters, CGMP, thrown around a lot. What exactly does that mean?
CGMP stands for Current Good Manufacturing Practice, and it's essentially a comprehensive set of regulations that the FDA uses to ensure the quality and safety of pharmaceutical products. Think of it as a way to guarantee that every step of the manufacturing process, from the raw materials to the final product, is carried out with the highest standards of quality and control.
So it's like a whole quality management system built into every stage of the process.
Exactly. CGMP regulations cover a huge range of things. They dictate things like, the design and upkeep of the manufacturing facilities, the calibration and maintenance of equipment, how personnel are trained, and the specific procedures that have to be followed for every aspect of the process. The goal is to minimize the risk of contamination, ensure that each batch of the drug is consistent in its quality and potency, and prevent errors and deviations.
So it's really about building quality into the product from the ground up.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that, manufacturing in this context isn't just about the actual production process. It covers every stage, from when the raw materials are received at the facility all the way to how the finished drug is packaged, labeled, and distributed.
Okay, so let's say a pharmaceutical company has developed a new drug that's shown promising results in preclinical testing and is ready to move into clinical trials in humans. What's the next step in the regulatory process?
That's where the Investigational New Drug Application, or IND, comes in. The IND is basically a request to the FDA for permission to start testing the new drug in humans.
And what kind of information does a company have to include in an IND?
It's a really comprehensive package. They have to provide all the data from their preclinical studies, those lab and animal tests that showed the drug is potentially safe and effective. They have to outline the proposed clinical trial design, including things like, how many participants will be involved, what doses will be tested, and what endpoints they'll be measuring. And they have to describe how they're going to manufacture the drug for use in the trials and provide assurances that it's being produced according to CGMP standards.
So it's like laying out the whole plan for the clinical development program.
Exactly. And the FDA reviews all of this information to make sure that the proposed clinical trials are ethically designed, that there are adequate safeguards in place to protect the participants, and that the data collected will be scientifically sound and reliable.
And once the IND is approved, then the company can start those human clinical trials.
Right. And those trials are typically divided into 4 phases. Phase 1 is usually conducted in a small group of healthy volunteers and is primarily focused on assessing the drug's safety, looking for any adverse effects, and determining how the drug is metabolized and excreted by the body. Phase 2 starts to explore whether the drug actually has the intended therapeutic effect in patients with the condition it's designed to treat.
So you're starting to get a sense of whether the drug is doing what it's supposed to do.
Right. And then phase 3 trials are much larger and more comprehensive. They involve a broader patient population and are designed to confirm both the drug's safety and effectiveness, as well as to gather more information about optimal dosing and any potential long-term effects.
So that's where you really get the robust data to support a marketing application.
Precisely. And then there's phase 4, which are studies that are conducted after the drug has already been approved and is on the market. These are often post-marketing surveillance studies to gather additional information about the drug's long-term safety and effectiveness in real-world settings.
So once a company has completed all those clinical trials, gathered all the data, and is ready to seek FDA approval to market the drug, what happens next?
That's when they submit a new drug application, or NDA. The NDA is basically a massive compilation of all the information that's been collected about the drug throughout its development.
It must be like a huge document.
Oh, yeah. It includes all the data from those preclinical studies and clinical trials, detailed information about the drug's chemistry and manufacturing process, how it's absorbed and metabolized by the body, the proposed labeling for the drug, and much more.
And what exactly is the FDA looking for when they review an NDA?
They're trying to answer some really fundamental questions. Is the drug safe and effective for its intended use? Do the benefits for patients outweigh the potential risks? Does the proposed labeling provide clear and accurate information about the drug's uses, risks, and precautions? And are the manufacturing controls robust enough to ensure that every batch of the drug meets the required quality standards?
It's a really rigorous evaluation process.
Absolutely. It usually takes the FDA about 10 months to review a standard NDA, although they can expedite the review for drugs that offer significant advantages over existing treatments. Those are given priority review, which can shorten the timeline to around 6 months. The FDA might also conduct inspections of the manufacturing facilities, and they often convene advisory committees made up of external experts to get their input on the application.
So after all that, what happens?
Well, the FDA will either approve the drug for marketing or issue what's called a complete response letter, which basically means not yet.
So they're saying, go back and address these issues before we can give you the green light.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what happens when a drug's patent protection expires. Other companies can then start making generic versions of that drug, right?
Right. And they don't have to go through that whole lengthy NDA process all over again, do they?
No, they don't. That's where the abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, comes in. The NDA pathway was created specifically for generic drugs, and it allows those manufacturers to piggyback on the data that was already generated for the original brand name drug. That's the reference listed drug, or RLD.
So they're essentially saying, look, our drug is basically the same as this one that's already been approved.
Exactly. But the key thing they have to demonstrate is bioequivalence. That means they have to show that their generic version of the drug releases the active ingredient into the bloodstream at the same rate and to the same extent as the brand name drug. It's not about proving safety and efficacy all over again. It's about showing that the two drugs are essentially interchangeable from a pharmacokinetic standpoint.
So the ANDA process involves a lot less work than an NDA.
Definitely. But it's still a pretty rigorous process. The generic company has to conduct those bioequivalence studies, provide detailed information about their manufacturing process and quality controls, and ensure that their proposed labeling is essentially identical to the brand name drug's label.
And the FDA reviews all of that information to make sure that the generic drug is truly equivalent to the RLD.
Right. They look at the bioequivalence data, they assess the safety and quality of the manufacturing process, and they make sure the labeling is appropriate. This whole system was put in place by the Hatch-Waxman Act back in 1984 and has been really successful in increasing the availability of affordable generic drugs.
And it's been great for consumers.
Absolutely. Okay, so now that we have a good handle on pharmaceuticals, let's move on to biologics. This is where things get a little more complicated, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely more complex. So first things first, what exactly is a biologic?
Unlike traditional pharmaceuticals, which are made through chemical synthesis, biologics are derived from living organisms.
So we're talking about things like vaccines, blood products, gene therapies, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And because they're made using living systems, biologics tend to be much larger and more complex molecules than pharmaceuticals. And the manufacturing process is far more sensitive and can really impact the final product's quality and consistency.
Right. So how does that difference in complexity play out in terms of the FDA's regulatory approach?
Well, for starters, biologics are primarily regulated under a different law, Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act, although they also meet the definition of a drug under the FD&C Act.
So they kind of straddle both worlds.
Exactly. And that's because they have characteristics of both drugs and, well, biological products. And the FDA recognizes that biologics require a slightly different approach when it comes to ensuring their safety and efficacy.
So if a company wants to get a biologic approved by the FDA, what's the process?
It's similar to the process for pharmaceuticals, but there are some important differences. The application they submit is called a Biologics License Application, or BLA.
Sounds like the NDA, but for biologics.
Right. And just like with an NDA, the BLA has to include a ton of data from preclinical studies, clinical trials, manufacturing information, and labeling. But the FDA also places a much heavier emphasis on characterizing the biologic molecule itself, on ensuring that the manufacturing process is extremely well controlled and consistent.
Because any slight variation in the process could lead to a different product, essentially.
Exactly. The FDA wants to be absolutely sure that every batch of a biologic is essentially identical to the one that was tested in clinical trials. And that's why you often hear people say, the product is the process, when they're talking about biologics.
Right. So the FDA's review of a BLA is really focused on making sure that the biologic is not only safe and effective, but also pure, potent, and consistent from batch to batch.
Precisely. And just like with drugs, there are standard and priority review timelines for BLAs, and there are also expedited programs for particularly promising therapies.
Okay, and one more thing I wanted to touch on with biologics is the concept of biosimilars. These are often called the generics of the biologics world, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. A biosimilar is a biologic that's highly similar to an already approved biologic that's the reference product.
So it's like a generic drug, but for biologic.
Right. And just like with generics, the goal of biosimilars is to provide more affordable treatment options for patients.
So how does a company get a biosimilar approved?
They have to demonstrate to the FDA that their biosimilar is highly similar to the reference product in terms of its structure, function, and clinical performance. And they have to show that there are no clinically meaningful differences in terms of safety, purity, and potency.
So the FDA is basically making sure that the biosimilar is essentially interchangeable with the reference product.
Exactly. And that's really important because biologics are such complex molecules.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that any biosimilar that comes on the market is truly comparable to the original product that it's referencing.
Okay, so let's summarize the key differences between pharmaceuticals and biologics for our listeners.
Sure. Pharmaceuticals are typically small, chemically synthesized molecules. They're regulated under the FD&C Act, and they go through the NDA or NDA pathway. Biologics, on the other hand, are large, complex molecules derived from living organisms. They're regulated primarily under the PHS Act, and they go through the BLA pathway. Manufacturing is absolutely critical for both, but it's even more so for biologics, and the FDA's oversight is generally more stringent for biologics as well.
Right, because of that inherent complexity. Okay, let's move on to the medical device industry. This is another huge area that the FDA regulates, and it's really diverse, right?
It is. The FDA defines a medical device very broadly. It could be an instrument, an apparatus, an implant, an in vitro reagent, even software. Basically, anything that's intended for use in diagnosing, treating, or preventing disease, or that affects the structure or function of the body, but that doesn't achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action.
So we're talking about everything from bandages and tongue depressors to pacemakers and artificial joints.
Exactly. And to manage this huge range of products, the FDA uses a risk-based classification system. Devices are classified into one of three classes, Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3, based on the level of risk they pose to patients.
So a low-risk device would be class 1 and a high-risk device would be class 3.
Right. And the level of regulatory control that the FDA applies to a device is directly proportional to its risk classification.
Makes sense. So what are some examples of class I devices?
Class I devices are things like, elastic bandages, examination gloves, handheld surgical instruments. They're generally simple in design and pose very little risk to patients.
So what kind of regulatory requirements do class I devices have to meet?
They're subject to general controls, which include things like registering their establishment with the FDA, listing their devices, following good manufacturing practices, and meeting certain labeling requirements.
Okay, and what about class 2 devices? What are some examples of those?
Class 2 devices are things like, powered wheelchairs, infusion pumps, some types of diagnostic imaging equipment. They're more complex than Class I devices, and they pose a greater potential risk to patients.
So they're subject to more stringent regulatory controls.
Right. In addition to those general controls, Class 2 devices are also subject to special controls.
And what do special controls involve?
It depends on the specific device, but it could be things like mandatory performance standards, post-market surveillance requirements, or even pre-market notification.
Okay, and now for the big one, class 3 devices. These are the highest risk devices, right?
Right. Class 3 devices are things like, heart valves, implantable defibrillators, life-sustaining ventilators. They're often used to support or sustain human life, and they pose the highest potential risk to patients.
So what kind of regulatory hurdles do they have to clear?
Class 3 devices generally have to go through the most rigorous regulatory pathway, pre-market approval, or PMA.
And that involves submitting a lot of data to the FDA, right?
Oh yeah, a PMA application is a really comprehensive submission. It has to include valid scientific evidence demonstrating that the device is safe and effective for its intended use. That typically means clinical trial data, the results of non-clinical testing, detailed manufacturing information, and a whole lot more.
So the FDA is really putting these high-risk devices through the ringer before they'll allow them on the market.
Absolutely. They want to be as certain as possible that these devices are safe and effective for patients. And the PMA review process is lengthy and complex, often taking a year or more.
Okay, and I understand there are also some alternative pathways for certain types of medical devices.
Right. There's the de novo classification, which is for novel devices that are low to moderate risk and don't have a predicate device.
A predicate device.
Yeah, that's a device that's already legally marketed and that the new device can be compared to. So for de novo, since there's no predicate, the company has to provide a lot more data to demonstrate the device's safety and effectiveness.
Okay, what are some of the other alternative pathways?
There's the humanitarian device exemption, or HDE, which is for devices that are intended to treat or diagnose rare diseases or conditions.
So conditions that affect a small number of people.
Right, and there's the custom device exemption, or CDE, which is for devices that are specifically made for a single patient.
So it's really tailored to that individual patient's needs.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered pharmaceuticals, biologics, and medical devices. Now let's talk about the last category, tobacco products. This is an area where the FDA's regulatory approach is quite different, isn't it?
It is, and it's been evolving quite a bit in recent years. So what exactly does the FDA consider to be a tobacco product?
It's pretty broad. It includes any product made or derived from tobacco that's intended for human consumption, as well as any components or accessories of those products. And importantly, it now includes nicotine from any source, even if it's not derived from tobacco.
So that covers cigarettes, cigars, chewing tobacco, e-cigarettes, all of that.
Exactly. But it doesn't include products that are already classified as drugs, devices, or combination products.
So nicotine replacement therapies, for example, would be regulated as drugs.
Right. Now, the key thing to understand about the FDA's regulation of tobacco products is that it's driven by a different standard than the one they use for drugs and devices.
Different in what way?
Well, for drugs and devices, the focus is on demonstrating that the product is safe and effective for its intended use. But for tobacco products, the FDA uses a public health standard.
So it's a more population-level perspective.
Exactly. They're looking at the overall impact of the product on public health, taking into account both users and non-users.
So they're considering things like rates of initiation, rates of cessation, and the overall burden of disease caused by tobacco use.
Precisely. And that's why the FDA has taken a number of steps in recent years to reduce the appeal of tobacco products, especially to youth.
Like banning certain flavors, requiring larger and more graphic warning labels, and restricting marketing and advertising.
Right. And they've also implemented stricter requirements for manufacturers, like requiring them to register their establishments, list their products and ingredients, and report on harmful or potentially harmful constituents.
So the FDA is really trying to use its authority to curb tobacco use and protect public health.
Absolutely. They've even proposed new manufacturing practice requirements, similar to CGMP for pharmaceuticals, to further ensure the quality and consistency of tobacco products.
Okay, so we've covered the four main categories: pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, and tobacco. Now let's talk about what happens when those lines start to blur. That's where combination products come in, right?
Right. A combination product is any product that combines two or more different types of regulated components.
Yeah.
So you could have drug device combination, a biologic device combination, a drug biologic combination, or even a product that combines all three.
And those combinations can take different forms. It's not always just everything mixed together in one product.
Right. You can have single-entity combination products where the different components are physically combined, like a pre-filled syringe. Then there are co-packaged combination products, where two or more separate products are packaged together, like a drug vial packaged with a syringe. And then there are cross-labeled combination products, where separate products are labeled with instructions to use them together.
So lots of different ways to combine these components. And how does the FDA decide how to regulate these combination products?
Well, the first step is to determine the product's primary mode of action, or PMOA.
PMOA, that's a new one. What's that?
It's basically the single most important therapeutic action of the combination product.
So which component is really driving the therapeutic effect?
Exactly. And once the PMOA has been determined, that will usually dictate which FDA center will take the lead in reviewing the product.
So if the primary mode of action is pharmacological, then CDER would take the lead.
Right. And if it's a device that's driving the therapeutic effect, then CDRH would take the lead.
And so on. And the PMOA also determines which regulatory pathway the product will follow.
Right. Whether it's an NDA, a BLA, a PMA, a 510K, or it's a novo.
So the FDA has to really look at each combination product on a case-by-case basis to figure out the best way to regulate it.
Exactly. And it can get pretty complicated. But the bottom line is that the FDA wants to make sure that all combination products are safe and effective, regardless of how they're put together.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's step back for a minute and do a little comparative analysis of the FDA's regulatory approaches for these four different industries.
Sure. The first thing to recognize is that the FDA has very different philosophies when it comes to regulating pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, and tobacco products.
Right. We've talked about that a bit already.
And those differences are reflected in the specific regulatory pathways and requirements that apply to each industry. For pharmaceuticals and biologics, the focus is really on safety and effectiveness.
That's always the top priority.
Absolutely. And they have to demonstrate that safety and effectiveness through rigorous preclinical and clinical testing.
Mm.
The FDA then does a thorough benefit risk assessment to make sure that the potential benefits of the product outweigh the potential risks for patients.
And for medical devices, it's more of a risk-based approach.
Right. The level of regulatory control is proportional to the level of risk that the device poses to patients. So low-risk devices have fewer regulatory hurdles to clear, while high-risk devices are subject to much more scrutiny. And we talked about how the 510K pathway for many medical devices relies on demonstrating substantial equivalence to a predicate device, which is a lower standard of evidence than the pre-market approval that's required for higher-risk devices.
And then for tobacco products, it's all about public health.
Right. The FDA's regulation of tobacco products is really driven by a desire to reduce the overall burden of disease caused by tobacco use. So they're looking at things like initiation rates, cessation rates, and the overall impact on public health.
So different philosophies, different approaches, but one thing that seems to be consistent across all four industries is the importance of risk assessment.
It is. The FDA is always trying to assess the level of risk that a product poses, whether it's a drug, a biologic, a medical device, or a tobacco product.
Yeah.
And The level of risk will then dictate the specific regulatory requirements that apply to that product.
So higher risk products face more scrutiny and have to provide more data to demonstrate their safety and effectiveness.
Exactly. And lower risk products can often get through the regulatory process more quickly and easily.
Another factor that seems to play a big role is manufacturing complexity.
It does. For biologics in particular, the manufacturing process is incredibly important because it can really impact the final product. So the FDA has very stringent requirements for biologics manufacturers to ensure that they're producing consistent, high-quality products.
And for pharmaceuticals, CGMP is key.
Right. Those good manufacturing practices are designed to ensure the quality of all pharmaceutical products. And for medical devices, there's the Quality System Regulation, which sets standards for the design, development, production, and servicing of medical devices.
And even tobacco products are now facing proposed manufacturing practice requirements.
Right. So the FDA is really focused on ensuring that all of these products are being manufactured to the highest standards to protect public health.
And ultimately, that's what it's all about, protecting and improving public health.
Exactly. The FDA's mission is to ensure that the American public has access to safe and effective medical products and to reduce the burden of disease caused by tobacco use.
Hmm.
And they're doing that by applying a really nuanced and tailored approach to each of these industries.
Right. They're not just using a one-size-fits-all approach. They're recognizing the unique characteristics of each industry and the different levels of risk that they pose.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for anyone involved in these industries to have a good understanding of the specific FDA regulations that apply to their products.
Right. Whether you're a researcher, a manufacturer, an investor, a healthcare professional, or just a consumer, it's really beneficial to understand how the FDA works and how they're working to protect public health.
It is. And it's also important to remember that the FDA is constantly adapting and evolving.
Yeah, they're always updating their guidance and regulations in response to new scientific information and emerging technologies.
Exactly. So it's important to stay up to date on the latest developments. The FDA has a ton of resources available on their website, including guidance documents, regulations, and information about recent approvals and enforcement actions.
Right. And there are also a lot of industry groups and publications that provide updates on the FDA and its activities.
Absolutely. So if you're involved in any of these industries, it's worth doing your research and staying informed about the latest regulatory developments.
It is, and it's definitely something that we'll continue to keep a close eye on here at the Deep Dive. Okay, so to wrap things up for our listeners, what are some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into FDA regulatory guidelines?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that the FDA employs a very nuanced and differentiated approach when it comes to regulating pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, and tobacco products.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Definitely not. The specific regulatory pathways and requirements that apply to each industry are tailored to the unique characteristics of those products and the different levels of risk that they pose. For pharmaceuticals and biologics, the focus is on demonstrating safety and effectiveness through rigorous preclinical and clinical testing. For medical devices, it's more of a risk-based approach, with the level of regulatory control being proportional to the level of risk that the device poses to patients. And for tobacco products, the regulatory framework is really driven by a desire to reduce the overall burden of disease caused by tobacco use.
And another key takeaway is the importance of risk assessment. The FDA is constantly trying to assess the level of risk that a product poses and to adjust its regulatory approach accordingly. Higher risk products face more scrutiny and have to meet more stringent requirements, while lower risk products can often get through the regulatory process more quickly and easily.
Exactly. And the FDA is also very focused on ensuring that all of these products are being manufactured to the highest standards. They have stringent manufacturing requirements in place for pharmaceuticals, biologics, and medical devices, and they've even proposed new manufacturing practice requirements for tobacco products.
Right. So they're really taking a holistic approach to product regulation,
Yeah.
looking at everything from the initial development process to the final manufacturing and marketing of the product.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point for listeners to understand. The FDA isn't just concerned with whether a product is safe and effective in the abstract. They're also concerned with how it's made, how it's labeled, and how it's marketed to consumers.
Right. They're really looking at the entire life cycle of the product. And I think another key takeaway is that the FDA is constantly evolving and adapting. They're always updating their guidance and regulations in response to new scientific information and emerging technologies.
Absolutely. So it's important to stay up to date on the latest developments. The FDA has a ton of resources available on their website, and there are a lot of industry groups and publications that provide updates on FDA activities.
Right. It's definitely a dynamic regulatory landscape. And I think it's also worth noting that the FDA is not just a regulatory agency. They're also involved in a lot of research and development activities.
Absolutely. They fund a lot of research, they collaborate with industry and academia, and they're constantly working to advance the science of product regulation.
So they're really playing a vital role in promoting